can't do a cold open. Not when I'm already on fire, that is. Hi, I'm Super Train Station H, and welcome to Part 6 of Barrier Aggression, my critical analysis of select material from Autism Confidential, the National Council on Severe Autism's podcast series, where last time, NCSA President Jill Escher took a brave stance by standing up to autistic people who not only think that they can get away with calling themselves autistic just because they're clinically diagnosed with autism, but also think that they can get involved in organizations relating to autism in spite of their being diagnosed with autism. But first, we need to talk specifically about the neurodiversity paradigm. It's been mentioned several times in my video series already, but I never specifically defined it in either of any of the people that I've been discussing in my videos to this point. The neurodiversity paradigm and the autism self-advocacy movement do have notable overlap, but they are not the same thing, nor does any unique organization officially preside over either of those things in the manner of a political party or a monolithic activist group. Now, there are groups within the autism self-advocacy movement that embrace the neurodiversity paradigm. They release position statements, organize activism initiatives for and against laws and policies. Those include bodies like the Autism Self-Advocacy Network ASAN or Naturally Autistic ANCA, just to name a couple, but they aren't Neurodiversity High Command or anything like that. So to give a brief synopsis from part of an introduction to neurodiversity from harvard.edu, the word neurodiversity refers to the diversity of all people, but it is most often used in the context of autism spectrum disorder, as well as other neurological or developmental conditions such as ADHD or learning disabilities, aiming to increase the acceptance and inclusion of all people while embracing neurological differences. Through online platforms, more and more autistic people were able to connect and form a self-advocacy movement. At the same time, Judy Singer, an Australian sociologist, coined the term neurodiversity to promote equality and inclusion of neurological minorities. While it is primarily a social justice movement, neurodiversity research and education is increasingly important in how clinicians view and address certain disabilities and neurological conditions. Well, that's just a brief, basic, bare-bones overview, and only a part of one at that, but I certainly didn't see anything about hating autistic people with higher support needs, though we're going to hear that accusation a lot from the NCSA and its allies.
Regarding cancellation, I think that unfortunately what we've seen amongst individuals who would be more on the end of the high-functioning autism, who don't have language impairment or intellectual disability, is a sad, almost immediate knee-jerk reaction to cancel those on the more severe end of the autism spectrum. And you do not see the reverse. You typically don't see caregivers of those with severe or profound autism who are not capable of engaging these types of discussions, wishing to cancel those on the higher functioning end of the spectrum.
Their existence is inherently awful to these people.
It's like I always say, you cannot fight for racial equity and spout anti-Semitism at the same time. That's incongruous, and if you act like that, you're just a hypocrite. And I think it's the same thing when you're looking for advocating for rights for people with disability. If you want to advocate for yourself as somebody with high-functioning autism, at the end of the day, you're just a hypocrite and just as bad as anybody else who has discriminated against people with disability if you're writing out of the equation those who are the most severely afflicted.
If you've seen my earlier videos, you should know by now that the NCSA has significant criticisms of both the neurodiversity paradigm and the autism self-advocacy movement, and personalities within and allied with the NCSA generally use the terms neurodiversity and self-advocacy interchangeably, in specific reference to what they call, across various instances, a mob of hyper-privileged, fully functional woke elitists who have incorrectly self-identified as autistic, and who not only dislike and want to suppress real autistic people with actual disabilities, but want to strip them of their status as disabled people so that we can live free of personal responsibility while wrongfully demanding access to disability benefits in spite of us being people who NCSA President Jill Escher who is not a fucking doctor, not only says aren't disabled, but have personality disorders, and that our autism diagnoses are a violent absurdity against Jill's own autistic children.
Strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks, are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And
like,
that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd.
On the website formerly known as Twitter, Jill explicitly said that the logical endpoint of neurodiversity is zero personal responsibility, and across various media, Jill and others within or aligned with the NCSA have released messages describing autistic people as out of line and in need of being held to task for publishing messages that contradict NCSA policy positions.
This is a check your privilege moment for the disability community. This is a check your privilege moment for the disability community. This is a check your privilege moment for the disability community.
In the case of the main NCSA podcast episode of interest to barrier aggression, my video series, messages from autistic people that the NCSA finds unacceptable include being interviewed in a news article in which autistic people with careers protest prejudice themselves and their colleagues have suffered due to their clinical diagnoses becoming known to employers and co-workers. I really didn't think that the NCSA would consider autistic people entering the workforce in self-sustaining capacity and protesting discrimination would be something upsetting enough for them to film a feature-length public indignation meeting about. But here we are, and Jill and her friends represent the very existence of articles like this to reflect not only what Jill calls a violent absurdity against real autistic people, but to reflect a refusal of these so-called perfectly functional, hyper-privileged people with personality disorders to accept responsibility for their own lives.
So some of the people that go into the soapbox and start claiming that all of their problems have been due by society instead of getting responsibility, their own responsibility for their problems.
Well, in a different episode of The Autism Confidential, Jill interviewed an ally of the NCSA, Dr. Manuel Cassanova, who stood along Jill in opposing the unacceptable behavior by autistic people of not only rejecting responsibility for their problems by demanding not to be mistreated, but for also having the nerve to call themselves autistic just because they were diagnosed with neurodevelopmental disabilities by their own doctors. Let's get started.
I would say that there's a lot of noise out there because many neurodiversity proponents that claim to be autistics are really not autistics. Okay, and you have to be very careful. Because,
I agree.
So some of the people that go into the soapbox and start claiming that all of their problems have been due by society instead of getting responsibility, their own responsibility for their problems. Some of them have really deep personality disorders.
So autistic people speaking out against mistreatment is just an excuse to avoid personal responsibility, huh? Well, yeah, I've actually heard that one before, specifically being told to me in person by an authority figure as they insisted that the disability supports that I was being denied were an unofficial courtesy that they were free to retract due to me claiming falsely to be disabled without any official basis for doing so. This is in spite of the fact that I had been diagnosed at a university in 1994 over the course of multiple day-long evaluation and testing sessions. Now, this is something I'd expect to hear from a disability bigot that was literally conspiring against me and nearly triggered a lawsuit, but I sure didn't think I'd hear that from someone who's said to be an autism advocate, speaking on the podcast of what is said to be a national autism advocacy not-for-profit. Well, Dr. Cassanova, I could at least admit from in-person experience that they certainly are silly assholes within the neurodiversity movement that aggressively parrot whatever they see on Tumblr or TikTok as gospel without examining it first through a critical lens, almost as though they have some kind of... But concerning problems faced by autistic people that are caused by society, I could speak to at least one of those problems that I face as an autistic person that was caused exclusively by society and not from my own personal descriptive profile of autism or a personality disorder in which I refuse to take responsibility for myself. And that problem was assholes who didn't know me assigning themselves the right to reject my diagnosis based on the idea that I was too successful to have clinically recognized disabilities worthy of reasonable accommodations. The person who went the furthest in doing that to me attempted to prevent me, as an otherwise straight-A college student, from getting my bachelor's degree by literally forging papers from my high school saying that I was self-diagnosed and wasn't entitled to the accommodations that would allow me to even attempt the final remaining class I needed to earn my degree, a class which single-handedly delayed me from completing my bachelor's degree by multiple years and added thousands upon thousands of dollars of debt to my tuition that a non-disabled student wouldn't have been asked to pay, even though I only enrolled in that college to begin with because they promised to accept my individual educational plan from high school. And they only began to falsely accuse me of claiming disability in bad faith after nearly a decade of them stealing my fucking money while demanding that I study harder and pull my own weight. But that's a story for another time. Let's let Dr. Cassanova speak, because I'm sure he'd like to keep going.
Ability. But I would like to keep on going on a tangent because you brought me memories, and I would call this like the Superman syndrome. Many of the people that really assume the diagnosis of autism.
Assume the diagnosis of autism. Yeah, spoilers for the rest of this series, but that sort of phrasing, assuming the diagnosis of autism, declaring themselves autistic, claiming to have autism, assuming the identity as autism, claiming the identity of autism, claiming whatever identity they want, and adopting an autistic identity. That sort of language is going to be used a lot by the panelists in this main NCSA podcast episode in question. And going forward, every single time they say it, at least as far as the material that I'm covering, they'll be saying that in the context of discussing autistic people who are known to be clinically diagnosed, or people whose diagnostic status goes unmentioned by those making the accusations of implied bad faith self-identification. Even if you personally may not take stock in self-diagnosis of autism, these NCSA panelists' consistent trend of describing specifically named and identified autistic people who are known to be clinically diagnosed as though they were self-diagnosed as a way to discredit them, in my opinion, ought to make you question these people's intentions. Because people who do that usually do it for sneaky and naughty reasons. Anyway, back to Dr. Cassanova.
I would call this like the Superman syndrome. Many of the people that really assume the diagnosis of autism and went public and went on a soapbox, they did so by wearing colored glasses. Okay, they would put in colored glasses and all of a sudden they were sensitive to light and they were autistic. Okay, They get out of their colored glasses and they are no longer autistic. It's the Superman identity.
Right.
I know I'm like pretending to have a live conversation with this obvious pre-recorded footage of the people that I'm criticizing, but I suddenly feel very specifically involved all of a sudden, because whether the person Dr. Cassanova is talking about was sincere, or if they're a silly disability impersonating asshole like the doctor insists, I was literally prescribed colored glasses for light sensitivity after years of suffering chronic headaches, whose outward symptoms caused ER doctors to initially think that I was having a stroke. They very nearly did a spinal tap on me to get to the bottom of it. And since I was already confused and scared and only an elementary school student that was in tremendous pain that I couldn't even speak to the doctors about, getting a spinal tap at that age, where I didn't even understand the concept of what that was, that would have been the only thing that could have made that experience more traumatic than it already was. Now, the doctor who prescribed my glasses, he was a specialist whose office was over 100 miles away. My family spent the night at a friend's house to attend the appointment. The glasses didn't even have a vision correction factor to them at that point. It was just the filter. And between 2002 and 2011, I wore them everywhere, at all moments of the day except while I was in the shower. They significantly reduced the headaches, and I admit they happen to look cool, especially as far as disability aids go. But aside from that, they made my life hell. Security guards at school were constantly yanking me by the sleeve in the halls and barking at me for them. Teachers tried to confiscate them, along with my word processors, which were another disability tool I needed that was part of my accommodations after my diagnosis. Other kids made fun of me for my glasses and bullied me for what they saw as me getting unfair special treatment and being allowed to wear sunglasses in class. And when I entered my teens, it made it impossible for me to get a job in spite of my documentation, even though I was chomping at the bit to realize the years of occupational therapy I had already gone through to test the limits of my capability for self-reliance by earning my own money as soon as possible. Now, I had a friend all throughout high school. In senior year, they made an unexpected visit to my house for the very first time. Even as someone who liked me, and who I thought understood my disability background, he was genuinely surprised that I answered the door with my glasses on and actually wore them at home. They thought it was an act I was putting on at school to attract attention to myself that I wouldn't bother with when I was at home. I really don't know the details of the person Dr. Cassanova is mocking for wearing these colored glasses of theirs. Maybe they're full of crap, but even if that were the case, I really don't want to think of how a potential employer or teacher who hears Dr. Casanova's story and has little outside background on disability might go on to treat a student or employee who's dealing with issues like I was throughout most of my early life, in which I ended up being prescribed dark glasses to manage clinically diagnosed sensory issues because I had actual real documentation, and I still got significant pushback in every aspect of my life in which I wore my glasses. Now, all that being said, if this unnamed person did turn out to be full of shit and was using dark glasses as a prop to play the role of a disabled person, they suck major ass, and they should find it so much the harder to enter paradise. But somehow, I'm finding myself rather skeptical of Dr. Casanova's framing of these people's backgrounds and behaviors. In my opinion, the quality of certain aspects of his criticisms of alleged autism impersonators, well, let's just say it enjoys considerable potential for improvement. Now, speaking of Dr. Casanova, he's on a roll, so what other falsely autistic people he wants to complain about while we're at it?
There was a very famous autistic, so-called autistic individual, self-proclaimed. She had a running controversy with Fred Volkmar.
For the purpose of this podcast, I have zero opinion regarding Fred Volkmar, but I just wanted to stop and mention that the YouTube auto captions rendered Fred Volkmar's name as Fred Voldemort, given the emotionally driven selective disregard for materially verifiable facts of actual reality that will be demonstrated throughout various NCA podcast materials going forward. It's only suitable that a character from the imagination of J.K. Rowling and her black mold brain parasite would make an appearance here. Everyone knows that sensible people keep their parasites on their tails.
And she wrote several books about autism, and she gave a lot of lectures around the world. And if you actually saw her, she wasn't really autistic at all.
Are you fucking kidding me with this shit?
And she wrote several books about autism, and she gave a lot of lectures around the world. And if you actually saw her, she wasn't really autistic at all.
And I want you to get out of this office right now.
I'm sorry, Zed.
No way.
You brought
No way.
You brought it on yourself.
I don't want you here.
I'm so
Out.
sorry, George. I didn't think it would go like this.
Out.
Ted, I got your voucher.
This is explicitly bigoted bullshit. This person is speaking as an authoritative source on the podcast of a not-for-profit organization that says it's advocating for autistic people, an organization that wants to shape actual laws about what services and benefits autistic people can access and what protections they'd have legally. And Dr. Cassava Melon is propagating explicitly discredited, bigoted bullshit about there being a clinically recognized visual profile of neurodevelopmental disability, by which you could simply look at someone without performing a clinical examination upon them and tell whether or not they possess scientifically recognized traits of neurodevelopmental deviation or impairment. No one should ever take anything this motherfucker says seriously again, and he does not deserve to be listened to or engaged with. But for the sake of protecting my ability to continue to explain how full of shit this man is and how shitty these NCSA podcasts are, I'm going to pretend he didn't say that for the most part. And mind you, the person he's talking about could still, also as well, be a fucking ass-munching disability fraudster dunce. I don't know, but if that were the case, that's a distinct and separate issue from Dr. C's implication that you could just see someone and credibly decide on the spot whether or not they're disabled. A claim that for some reason NCSA podcast recordings on YouTube happen to end up getting comments with supporters parroting these messages, that if someone doesn't look like a very specific archetype, there's no way they can be disabled. And that's just YouTube comment bullshit. But this guy is an actual doctor, and Jill, president of the National Council on Severe Autism, heard this shit, didn't correct them, and still decided to publish this podcast under the NCSA banner, which makes me wonder what this group's intentions of advocating public policy really include, because we already have a widespread problem where people with lifelong clinically documented disabilities and impairments of all kinds can't get benefits and assistance because they fail to meet a very specific stereotype of what a disabled person is allegedly supposed to look like. I personally refuse to play the clips since they discuss Jill's children in detail, but on outside podcast appearances, Jill, in her own phrasing, has explained how her son, who she describes as severely autistic, is traditionally handsome, and she does that to make the specific point that you can't merely look at someone and determine that they might have a descriptive profile of autism that embodies extreme lack of capability for self-reliance, that demands 24/7 hands-on support on a lifelong basis. That is true, but coinciding with that, Jill's reality is custom tailor-made to her needs, to the point that the actual fact of real life, that you can't look at someone and tell they're autistic, is valid for her when she's conveying the characteristics of her high support needs autistic son. But when it comes to people with lower support needs, the fact that Dr. C here claims to have looked at them and allegedly saw that they weren't autistic somehow counts as valid, as a way to debunk the disability status of someone who's autistic without Jill and the NCSA's permission. There are other examples I've already covered in barrier aggression, and will cover in future videos, where Jill refuses to challenge statements that she is provably aware are incorrect, as long as those statements are being uttered in a context that dismisses, minimizes, or denies the disability status of autistic people that she considers relatively higher functioning. And in this case, she lets Dr. Supernova spew oral pestilence, suggesting that one can look at an autistic person and determine them to be faking if they don't fit a specific visual profile of disability. Coincidentally, when people do outwardly meet those very specific stereotypes of disability, that is used as proof against them, as proof that they're faking. Jill agrees with that notion, or at least she failed to challenge it when she was a panelist on Peter Boghossian's podcast and someone else said that shit.
That's the problem with, we got rid of Asperger's as a condition, and it was sort of subsumed into the autism spectrum disorder umbrella in 2013, and that's where I think a lot of the issues we're currently having come from, because I think neurodiversity movement, that would have been fine if it was just Asperger's. Like, yes, you have a difference, not a disability, that's fine, but they're just sort of speaking on behalf of everybody. They lean into dysfunction online is what I see, because they're in these online communities and they're observing other people, and other people will say like, well, you don't seem autistic, and so they just sort of like lean into whatever it is that they conceptualize autism to be. and they like become more dysfunctional and disabled because of it. That's what my observation.
Okay, so if an allegedly autistic person doesn't look or sound or act stereotypically autistic to a non-disabled outsider, it's proof that they aren't autistic. But if an allegedly autistic person does look or sound or act stereotypically autistic, it's proof that the person is putting on an act to play into stereotypes and role play as autistic to validate their fantasy of being disabled. And all Jill does is smile and go along with it, because she'll seemingly go along with anything as long as it promotes ridicule and skepticism toward autistic people other than those who closely resemble her own kids. And that brings us back to Dr. C making accusations of someone claiming in bad faith to be autistic. We already know this guy's full of shit regardless because of his claim to be able to see people and confirm based on their looks that they are or are not autistic. But what else does he have to say about people that we could use to prove that he's even more full of shit?
She had a running controversy with Fred Volkmar, and she wrote several books about autism, and she gave a lot of lectures around the world. And if you actually saw her, she wasn't really autistic at all.
I find it interesting that Dr. C didn't provide this allegedly autistic person's name in spite of them being a world-renowned public figure. If he wants to protect her from undue personal harassment, in spite of his dislike for her, more power to him. But it just so happens that now I can't look up or verify any of this, and I'm just supposed to trust him, I guess. Somehow, I don't want to trust someone who claims that they can look at someone and based on that debunk their status as a person with a neurodevelopmental disability. Even aside from that, it's more than possible that the person in question actually could be a silly shithead that was faking autistic traits. But I've come to learn that with NCSA members and allies that if they make accusations without explaining or providing proof, and don't provide links to sources and reference material, it sometimes seems to turn out that the actual facts of what they're complaining about resemble the podcast panelists' spoken version of it, only in the vaguest, most imprecise manner possible at best. Now keep that in mind for later on during the rest of my video series, because thanks to this little detour into a different episode of the Autism Confidential from the NCSA, we've got at least 1 or 2 more videos to go before I finish up barrier aggression, not even counting the one you're watching now. But anyway, Dr. C needs to present his proof on how flagrantly non-autistic this person is, so let's let him keep going.
She had a running controversy with Fred Volkmar, and she wrote several books about autism, and she gave a lot of lectures around the world. And if you actually saw her, she wasn't really autistic at all.
I really can't believe that Dr. C seems to be treating the fact that this person traveled and gave lectures as proof that they must not be autistic. I could only guess what this person would think of Temple Grandin or Greta Thunberg. Interestingly enough, Jill, throughout her many podcast appearances, has made several entirely positive mentions of Temple Grandin.
Temple Grandin, Temple Grandin, Temple Grandin, Temple Grandin, and certainly Temple Grandin.
Meanwhile, in the comment section of NCSA YouTube videos and in the YouTube comments of third-party video podcast episodes Jill was a guest panelist on, Greta Thunberg, for some reason, keeps getting brought up as a contemptuous example of a falsely autistic person stealing the limelight of real autistic people due to her alleged act of posing as disabled. And mind you, if you think I'm sticking up for Greta Thunberg or anything she may personally happen to believe, you need to understand that I care about Greta Thunberg as much as I care about Sia, who I discussed in my second barrier aggression video. To me, Greta is just another public figure with no impact on my life, who I hear about sparingly, unintentionally, and through a drip feed of cultural osmosis forcibly IV injected into my brain by the mere presence of myself within modern industrialized civilization. That being said, I'm curious as to why someone who believes messages from Jill Escher in the NCSA somehow might have negative feelings about Greta Thunberg, an autistic person who isn't perpetually relying on outside help to communicate her opinions. It's almost as though Jill and the NCSA have specialized in promoting dislike for such autistic people regardless of what they believe, though I'm sure that's just an elaborate coincidence with no measurable correlation. Because after all, even though there are plenty of sound bites of Jill speaking positively of Temple Grandin, even though Jill happens to like her, an autistic person who holds high-level academic degrees, including at the doctorate level, someone who's traveled and gave lectures, and also, Jill has no problem, in spite of that, letting her guest, Dr. C, hold an unnamed other autistic person in contempt for traveling and going on lectures.
And she wrote several books about autism, and she gave a lot of lectures around the world. And if you actually saw her, she wasn't really autistic at all.
As though he believes that a legitimately autistic person, as an obvious matter of fact, would have no capability to attempt such a thing. While in general, Dr. C seems to treat autistic talent or creative activity as a probable cause to suspect them of insincerely claiming to be autistic, to embrace an archetype of, I guess, affliction, adding an element of romanticized struggle to someone's identity as an artist. He validates this by giving an account of alleged historical behavior in relation to artists facetiously self-identifying as having tuberculosis.
It's nothing new. Okay, it has been around forever and ever, and it's a way of romanticizing a condition. Mm-hmm. It happened during the Renaissance when we thought that some people that suffer from madness were somehow geniuses. I mean, during the Romantic period and the Elizabethan era, we had tuberculosis, and tuberculosis was called the disease of the artists and the poets. And people actually imitated the emaciated appearance of a tuberculous patient, and they refused to go out to the sunlight because they wanted to be pale, all because of this romantic idea. And that has never sort of withered away. It has remained with us that sometimes abnormalities in terms of psyche, in terms of cognition, has an ulterior motive, and it's an idea that has permeated our way of thinking for generations.
Given that my last barrier aggression video consisted of an hour-long discussion concerning barely a minute worth of NCSA sound bites, I really don't have time to research whether or not Dr. C's anecdote is historically accurate. And while it's certainly stupid enough to qualify as plausible human behavior, for the sake of full disclosure, I just want to say that I consider myself human for the purposes of that statement and that I am not an anti-human racist. Whether this actually even happened or not, the fact that he's using it now to promote public distrust of autistic people's struggles is disturbing, let alone the fact that an alleged autism advocacy group is now allowing him to use their platform to broadcast these messages. The next thing you know, he's going to be using an autistic person's participation in art and poetry competitions to draw skepticism towards the sincerity of their disability status.
If you actually saw her, she wasn't really autistic at all. She had some skills, and it was sort of funny. She would write poetry.
Wow, that sure didn't take long. These calls of mine are so uncanny that it's almost like I reviewed this footage in advance and drafted a script with my commentary, which is of course exactly what I did, because that's how these types of videos are made, even though I know that in spite of that, some dumbass useless fuckface is probably going to accuse me of cheating for doing that, if it happens that these videos of mine even end up having the slightest amount of meaningful viewership.
She wasn't really autistic at all. She had some skills, and it was sort of funny. She would write poetry, she would paint, and tuberculosis was called the disease of the artists and the poets. She wasn't really autistic. It was sort of funny. She would write poetry, she would paint, and tuberculosis was called the disease of the artists and the poets. It was sort of funny. She would write poetry.
Oh, so she's an autistic poet, huh? So this person wears dark glasses and they're an autistic poet. You know, if I was paranoid and self-absorbed, I'd think this Dr. C person was talking about me, except I'm not famous whatsoever. Now, I do want to suspect that Dr. C specifically mentioned poetry to discredit the notion that this person could possibly be legitimately autistic. Because autistic people can't do that, right? I mean, just ignore this anthology of poetry by autistic poets that I grabbed from my bookshelf. That's just an illusion, right? And ignore this other book that's specifically about higher support needs autistic people for whom poetry is one of the few forms of communication that makes their ideas and thoughts accessible in a way the outside world deems to reflect actual human sapience. Yeah, totally a massive hoax. Anyway, as Dr. Cassanova was saying,
she had some skills, and it was sort of funny. She would write poetry, she would paint, and she believed that she was great at both and sent her submissions to different competitions. And I was one in England about autistic talent, and she sent her work, and the experts actually graded her like a 5th or 6th grader. Okay?
So Dr. C is saying this, that this person's poetry, their artwork, it was graded by an expert in a manner that an expert would grade the project of a 5th or 6th grader? Or is Dr. C saying that this expert assessed her poetry and artwork as reflecting skill or talent that one would expect from a 6th grader? Either way, Dr. C is telling the story where the point seems to be to discredit this person's beliefs about autism and disability. But he does this by saying that she thought her artwork was great, but she entered an art or poetry competition for creators in England, and it got judged as not very impressive, I suppose, because the expert rated it as tantamount to something made by a 12 or 13-year-old. Now, being in the creative world, it is fun to hear when people who think they're more talented than they are getting taken down a peg if they deserve it and we're being jerks about it. But this is supposed to be about their credibility in relation to issues of disability discourse. And ultimately, Dr. C is accusing this person of claiming in bad faith to be autistic based on her being told by a judge that her art sucks? In a contest for autistic people who would naturally have various significant functional impairments.
It was sort of funny. She would write poetry, she would paint, and she believed that she was great at both and sent her submissions to different competitions. And I was one in England about autistic talent, and she sent her work, and the experts actually graded her like a 5th or 6th grader. Okay?
I don't get it. If she wanted to be told that her art sucks so much that it proves she's autistic, she could have just posted it directly to the internet. If the judge thinks that her art is like a 6th grader's, that certainly blows my art out of the water, because my art looks like a kindergartner did it. And simple pictures like these take me hours to complete, and the characters are all googly-eyed worms because those are relatively easy for me to draw. In fact, I came about these simply because I had to draw original cartoon characters for art project as a kid, and this is all I could manage. I mean, I remember being told as early as 1st grade that my stick figure dogs were inappropriately undetailed and that I needed to try harder by my art teacher. No wonder I hated art growing up. So yeah, this art contest story, it just seems kind of strange to me, and the nature of how Dr. C is explaining it, as well as the supposed purpose of this story. I mean, this person Dr. C is talking about could be a huge asshole. I can't know, because I don't know who they are. But the way Dr. C is framing it makes this seem strangely personal in ways that don't really deal with their trustworthiness and their opinions on disability, let alone their actual disability status, which is what Dr. C is intending to discredit with this story.
It was sort of funny. She would write poetry, she would paint, and she believed that she was great at both and sent her submissions to different competitions. And I was one in England about autistic talent, and she sent her work, and the experts actually graded her like a 5th or 6th grader. Okay? But she was autistic, and she had a lot of sway around the world in regards to the autism community. selling symptoms that nobody else had, okay, calling for accommodations and
It's not my business as an unrelated outsider to speculate on the sincerity of someone else's disability accommodation request. But even if I were to indulge myself in doing so, because Dr. C just expects us to trust him that these accommodations were unreasonable, there's no way I could even assess for myself if they were unreasonable or not. To give an example, I'm going to be discussing further on into barrier aggression an autism attack mom in the comments of an NCSA YouTube video. For some reason, someone watched Dr. Lee Wachtel complain about woke autistic self-advocates thriving in luxury while the severely disabled suffered, and they got inspired to complain about the parent of an autistic college student, as well as the student themselves, supposedly being wrongfully entitled because he asked to stand at his desk during class as a disability accommodation. The Karen in the comments treats the student's mere ability to attempt a college degree as an obvious invalidation of the idea that they could be legitimately autistic. They also present his request to stand at his desk without any context to validate their complaint that high-functioning autistic people don't face real challenges and just want unreasonable special treatment for no reason, and so they claim the identity of being autistic. Based on context, I'd hazard to speculate that the allegedly falsely autistic student in question potentially had a skeletal, muscular, neurological, or other disorder in addition to their autistic traits that could make it painful or impossible to sit for hours at a time in a typical college lecture hall environment. But this Karen presented it like this non-disabled spoiled brat and his entitled mother wanted to disrupt class for no reason by falsely claiming to be autistic and insulting the struggles of real autistic people like her child. The point is, the context of a request for disability accommodation matters, and Dr. C is giving us nothing to go on. He's literally saying nothing and asking us to dislike this person based on that alone. If YouTube and the NCSA existed when I was in high school, I could imagine some angry parent commenting on one of the NCSA videos to rant about me for me wearing so-called sunglasses in school and for getting to play on a laptop during class as accommodations for made-up disabilities, all while stripping those complaints of the context that led to me being provided with those accommodations following my diagnosis. The only reason I wanted to bring up Dr. C in the first place was to comment on his opinions about autistic people being involved in autism organizations. So let's get back to that.
We're concerned about, the impediments to research, but also impediments to clinical practice and policy, the policies that facilitate, right, the availability, the access, right, to needed interventions.
I see people in associations that are layman support organizations for autism. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, in order to be fair, they put autistic individuals into their boards. Mm-hmm. Usually those are the more prominent autistic individuals that they can find and use them as a banner for their organization. And you examine their credentials and you will find that in one case, the individual at most may have had PDD, NOS, autism, but when he was examined, maybe at 4 years of age, he was completely normal.
Wait,
okay.
What?
So he never had an official diagnosis, but he's given information and feedback as an autistic individual within a scientific advisory board.
Right.
Wait, what? Huh?
And you examine their credentials and you will find that in one case, the individual at most may have had PDD, NOS, autism, but when he was examined, maybe at 4 years of age, he was completely normal. Mm-hmm. Okay, so he never had an official diagnosis, but he's given information and feedback as an autistic individual within a scientific advisory board.
Right.
For those not in the know, PPD-NOS stands for Pervasive Developmental Disorder Not Otherwise Specified, which was an actual clinically recognized diagnosis from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, within what was then called the pervasive developmental disorder range, directly adjacent to autistic disorder, though framed as a separate diagnostic category in 1994 alongside Asperger's syndrome in the DSM-4. In 2013, when the now current DSM-5 came out, the former pervasive developmental disorder category that included autistic disorder, PPD-NOS, and Asperger's was restructured into what are now listed as neurodevelopmental disorders. And in the entry for the current autism spectrum disorder, it explicitly states that patients who had an Asperger's disorder or PPD-NOS diagnosis should be assigned autism spectrum disorder. So in understanding that, let's hear Dr. C again.
And you examine their credentials, and you will find that in one case, the individual at most may have had PDD-NOS autism, but when he was examined, maybe at 4 years of age, he was completely normal. Okay, so he never had an official diagnosis, but he's given information and feedback as an autistic individual within a scientific advisory board. And
Dr. C, you literally just said that he was diagnosed with an actual officially distinguished category of neurodevelopmental disability from the DSM-4, the characteristic set of which was later incorporated into autism spectrum disorder when the DSM-5 was activated in 2013.
And you examine their credentials, and you will find that in one case, the individual at most may have had PDD-NOS autism, so he never had an official diagnosis, but he's given information and feedback as an autistic individual within a scientific advisory board. And had PDD-NOS autism, so he never had an official diagnosis. Had PDD-NOS autism, had PDD-NOS autism, had PDD-NOS autism.
Dr. C, you literally just called it autism. I can't fucking believe this. You said that he was autistic and used that as proof that he was wrongfully representing himself as being autistic.
And you examine their credentials, and you will find that in one case, the individual at most may have had PDD-NOS autism, but when he was examined, maybe at 4 years of age, he was completely normal. Okay, so he never had an official diagnosis, but he's given information and feedback as an autistic individual within a scientific advisory board. And
how can this guy seriously argue that someone wasn't diagnosed with a disability on the autism spectrum and the same sentence that they said that they were diagnosed with a disability that was on the autism spectrum? I seriously can't fucking believe this. Like, how is this what the National Council on Severe Autism, that seeks to educate the public on autism, thinks of as quality discourse in disability, as they literally accuse people of disability impersonation and ask for donations from the public so they could champion laws that can change what services and supports and protections autistic people have, which they want to exclude these allegedly falsely autistic people from being considered eligible for. People who they know are literally autistic. Dr. C's accusation that this person was not diagnosed with a neurodevelopmental disorder is the assertion that the person in question was diagnosed with a neurodevelopmental disorder. This is like questioning someone's academic credentials by accusing them of being a high school dropout, yet claiming to have finished high school when they really didn't. And the proof of them having dropped out of high school is the fact that they have a diploma certifying that they've completed a 4-year course of study approved by their local Board of Education. If there's critical information Dr. C failed to mention about this case, such as the person in question having self-diagnosed with PPD-NOS prior to 2013, I have no idea. Whatever I or anyone else feels about the validity of self-diagnosis, I'd be having a very different response to Dr. C's story about this person supposedly wrongfully assuming autism as an identity to speak with undeserved authority from the perspective of a neurodevelopmentally disabled person. If Dr. Cassanova wants to dismiss this person's credibility as a person with autism on the basis of them not having been given an official diagnosis of DSM-5 autism spectrum disorder due to them having been diagnosed during the DSM-4 era and being given a diagnosis of PPD-NOS before that diagnosis was renamed and restructured into autism spectrum disorder as it exists in the DSM-5. Does that mean that Dr. C believes that everyone diagnosed under an older version of the DSM needs to be professionally reevaluated to be treated as legitimate? I don't know if that's what he means, but if it is, not only is that absurdly impractical, but it would specifically cause a bunch of former Asperger's and PPD-NOS diagnoses to be formally reassigned with autism spectrum disorder, because that's exactly what the DSM-5 itself says should happen to these people. And given Jill's views on the DSM-5, that's the last thing I think she wants to happen, lest the violent radical absurdity against Jill's autistic children that is relatively higher functioning autism escalate even further.
Strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks, are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And
like,
that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd.
Yeah, Jill, that's not fucking biased at all. It can't possibly be biased, right, Jill? Because Jill Escher, president of the National Council on Severe Autism, is good, and bias, on the other hand, is bad. So there's no way Jill can be biased by saying that.
It boggles my mind, and it shouldn't be that way. It's completely irrational.
Good fucking grief. Let's hear from Dr. C again.
And you examine their credentials, and you will find that in one case, the individual at most may have had PDD-NOS autism, but when he was examined, maybe at 4 years of age, he was completely normal. Mm-hmm. Okay, so he never had an official diagnosis, but he's given information and feedback as an autistic individual within a scientific advisory board.
Right.
Okay, so you're saying that this person is wrongfully claiming to be autistic because he wasn't diagnosed at the age of 4? I mean, I was described as being diagnosed at a very early age, and for me, that meant around age 6 or 7. In another podcast episode, Jill has mentioned someone being diagnosed at age 18 as an example of late diagnosis of autism. But Dr. C is criticizing the validity of this person's diagnosis because they weren't diagnosed as early as age 4?
And you examine their credentials, and you will find that in one case, the individual at most may have had PDD-NOS autism, but when he was examined, maybe at 4 years of age, he was completely normal. Mm-hmm. Okay, so he never had an official diagnosis, but he's given information and feedback as an autistic individual within a scientific advisory board.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to interpret that Dr. Cassiopeia seriously believes that neurodevelopmental disability diagnoses aren't official unless they're assigned at the age of 4 years old or earlier. I've even heard people that I'd describe as skeptical or adversarial towards the validity of high-functioning autism apparently believe that 4 years of age is too early to make a definitive diagnostic assessment of someone that's singularly defined their developmental potential.
But I would tend to go with the older age, 7 or 8, because in that 2 to 3 year old range, I mean, that's where we're really in like the height of early intervention and optimization of language skills, optimization of activities of daily living, and all of those necessary skills, and trying to get that young person, that toddler or preschooler, kind of bump them up in the developmental notches. And I think it would be a mistake to look at, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old and just expect that's what you're going to get. And that's also not really supported by the literature, because I think one of the best prognostic factors that we always come back to would be like language skills at like age 5, age 6. And so I don't think we can like just reject or discount any of the role of like intensive early intervention, and then maybe reconsidering when that child becomes like more of like a school-age child.
Yeah, that's right. I actually use Dr. Gaiman Wachtel as a primary source. When I'm able to use someone who's so fucking silly that they compared autistic doctors speaking out against workplace discrimination to anti-Semitic racists as a source to explain how dumb you are, you really fucked up big time super bad.
To prevail. I think that we're stuck in the United States with like skewing reality for a lot of fantasy on many levels, and at some point that like needs to stop. Particularly when it comes to, it's just the whole thing of like fighting for equality, equity, and like equal rights for everybody. It's like I always say, you cannot fight for like racial equity and like spout anti-Semitism at the same time. That's incongruous, and if you act like that, you're just a hypocrite. And I think it's the same thing when you're advocating for rights for people with disability. If you want to advocate for yourself as somebody with high functioning autism, at the end of the day, you're just a hypocrite, and just as bad as anybody else who has discriminated against people with disability, if you're writing out of the equation those who are the most severely afflicted.
I mean, I could have easily found statements along those lines from a wide selection of credible individuals that I don't significantly dislike. But I happen to have had the footage of Dr. Wachtel handy for this project anyway, and I'm basically never going to agree with her again for these 3 remaining episodes of Barrier Aggression after this one, so I might as well give her a break on the tail end of this series. Anyway, back to Dr. Casval Rem-Daiken.
And you examine their credentials, and you will find that in one case, the individual at most may have had PDD, NOS, autism, but when he was examined, maybe at 4 years of age, he was completely normal. Mm-hmm. Okay, so he never had an official diagnosis, but he's given information and feedback as an autistic individual within a scientific advisory board.
Right.
And
there's no other reasonable possibility that I could consider at this point. It really seems like Dr. C is saying that he could retract or dismiss someone's diagnosis as unofficial because it wasn't conducted when the person was at pre-kindergarten age. That is not helping the ongoing misconception that neurodevelopmental disorders are only valid or relevant within young children. Many autistic and disabled people age out of public or insurance-backed supports and services based on the notion that people outgrow being autistic or disabled at the age of 18 or 21. That's a problem that adversely impacts autistic people of every description and support needs level, especially those that the NCSA was founded to protect the interests of in the first place.
So he never had an official diagnosis, but he's given information and feedback as an autistic individual within a scientific advisory board.
Right.
Depending on the specific purpose of this advisory board, his specific role within that board, perhaps their academic background or scientific credentials, could be a valid topic of discussion as to whether or not it's useful or constructive for them to be involved in the way that they are. But all that Dr. Cornucopia has argued against this autistic person's involvement in that organization is the fact that he doesn't like that this person was diagnosed after the age of 4, and potentially that, according to Dr. C, that maybe that their PPD-NOS diagnosis isn't valid because PPD-NOS isn't featured as a diagnosis in the DSM-5. I mean, he didn't say that, but that's the most sensible attempt I could really make at explaining his position. because I've frequently seen this argument used to insist that former PPD-NOS and Asperger's diagnoses have no place in the modern understanding of disability and autism because those disorders were erased from the DSM in 2013. But that set of clinically notable characteristics and impairments that defined former PPD-NOS and former Asperger's weren't debunked or discredited or abolished from being considered worthy as legitimate disabilities. Those corresponding profiles were just restructured to be part of the new autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. You know, a lot of autism attack moms and other critics of high-functioning autism describe the transition to the DSM-5 as this imperialistic conquest where the DSM-5 came out, established the concept of high-functioning autism out of nowhere without any established precedent or scientific basis. And then people diagnosed with PPD-NOS and Asperger's syndrome suddenly had a green light to wage a war of invasion, a campaign against low-functioning autistic people, claiming their resources as war booty and dismissing those already within the semantic space of autism as being illegitimate. And it might seem extreme or weird for me to depict high-functioning autism critics as people who believe that autistic people outside of the so-described severe subcategory are people that have declared war against their lower-functioning autistic children. But the NCSA's president considers the ability for people that aren't specifically like her children, people like me, to be diagnosed clinically with autism spectrum disorder, to be a radically absurd act of violence against her children.
Strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks, are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And like, that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd.
The reality is, when the DSM-5 came out, a lot of people who lost their old diagnostic nomenclature had their lives disrupted by that. For instance, I know a number of Asperger's diagnoses who are having their support needs and accommodations newly questioned, and their very description as disabled challenged, because a lot of people with no background on how DSM revisions work hear secondhand that Asperger's syndrome, for example, is no longer a clinically recognized diagnosis, and then carry on thinking that the characteristics of Asperger's were proven to be fraudulent, or that the category had been discredited as a quack diagnosis. So to repeat myself, people with professionally documented difficulties suddenly had supports and accommodations being challenged or retracted because of this. And that makes it odd to me when autism attack parents and other critics of high-functioning autism see the DSM-5 transition as a wrongfully won unilateral victory for relatively higher-functioning autistic people that came at the massive detriment of their relatively lower-functioning autistic loved ones. Like, no, that just didn't fucking happen.
Strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks, are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And
like,
that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd.
Every time I review this footage, I can barely believe she said that shit and didn't think twice before publishing it. I can't guess how many of the online neurodiversity partisans Jill complains about all the time. The people that exhibit militant behavior in autism self-advocacy, the people that are actually antisocial in the clinical sense, not antisocial in the sits quietly alone reading a book during a party sense. How many of the people acting that way, and acting in a way that I wouldn't put up with if I were paid to do so, are only doing that in response to being accused of disability impersonation, being accused of hating autistic people, specifically because of inflammatory shit like what people such as Jill say. And Jill isn't just some random frustrated mom upset at the wrong people. She's the president of the NCSA, saying that the ability for people to be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder is an extreme act of violence against helpless disabled children. That what NCSA allies, what panelists like Dr. Carmen Lopez Arvizu, when they say things like clinically diagnosed autistic people describing themselves as autistic is an extreme act somehow. that it supposedly disrupts access real autistic people need to support services they rely on special education they depend on to attempt to function in a typical public school environment when their parents wouldn't be able to send them to a specialized school.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or letting themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
Like Dr. Arvizu, direct comments like that are not only clinically diagnosed, but they're diagnosed in a category that was determined to require access to those services for at least the last 30 years. I have to wonder how many of the irate partisans the NCSA complains about were created by the actions of NCSA members and allies in the first place. But considering that the NCSA is acting like that now, however the stupid chicken and the egg game started, it's no wonder that Jill's other ally in the NCSA in this podcast excuses people of wrongfully describing themselves as autistic, and that his evidence of this alleged wrongdoing is the fact that the person in question was literally clinically diagnosed with a scientifically recognized suite of neurodevelopmental disability traits that are now part of autism spectrum disorder.
And you examine their credentials and you will find that in one case, the individual at most may have had PDD, NOS, autism, but when he was examined, maybe at 4 years of age, he was completely normal. Mm-hmm. Okay, so he never had an official diagnosis, but he's given information and feedback as an autistic individual within a scientific advisory board.
Right.
And
I won't mention names, but several very prominent advocates come to mind who, in my view, just simply do not meet diagnostic criteria for autism. Certainly, I think they have issues.
She doesn't say it here in the podcast with Dr. Cassanova, but a few months down the line, in the podcast episode of Main Importance to Barrier Aggression, Jill offers her suggestion to what autistic people who can do more things than our own children should be re-diagnosed with instead.
Is there anything in the book that could be applied instead of autism, some kind of personality disorder?
Wow, I wonder where you got that idea from a few months earlier, Jill.
Many neurodiversity proponents that claim to be autistic are really not autistics. Some of them have really deep personality disorders.
Is there anything in the book that could be applied instead of autism, some kind of personality disorder?
Some of them have really deep personality disorders.
Some kind of personality disorder.
In full acknowledgement of the fact that mental disorders and any abnormal or atypical diagnosable or clinically recognized condition regarding functionality of the brain is still tremendously stigmatized in ways that cost people their lives, even with all the progress that's been made. I think it's really telling that Jill has decided that autistic people who may be able to attempt things that our own children cannot should be removed, evicted from the relatively sympathetic diagnostic, semantic space of her children, and be placed in a semantic space that she has to be aware is significantly perceived as less sympathetic in the mainstream popular consciousness of the Western world.
So he never had an official diagnosis, but he's given information and feedback as an autistic individual within a scientific advisory board.
Right. I won't mention names, but several very prominent advocates come to mind who, in my view, just simply do not meet diagnostic criteria for autism. Certainly, I think they have issues.
Jill, your opinion doesn't fucking matter. You aren't a doctor. And even if you were a doctor, you never fucking met these people. You're not their doctor. Your opinion still wouldn't fucking matter. You're so full of shit that I could smell you through my screen, and that isn't just because I have a colossal schnoz that makes Nigel Thornberry look like a pug. Now, being the president of a so-called autism council that you helped to create in the first place doesn't give you the authority, Jill, to retract people's autism diagnoses. I know I'm just a cartoon dog alien that isn't vetted or accredited by anybody, but I'm not the one making claims about people's neurodevelopmental disability status. But you, Jill, not only do that to public autistic figures that you and your pals keep strategically anonymous, but you also do that to specifically named individuals that you know are clinically diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And you're agreeing with Dr. C's assertion that the unnamed specific person in this anecdotal example should not be on an advisory board regarding autism because they allegedly aren't autistic. But Jill, even if that's true, you aren't autistic either, and you're the president of the National Council on Severe Autism. I'm not saying that you, not being autistic, should necessarily disqualify you from being involved in an autism organization, even if others may personally believe that. But I do find it highly ironic that you would agree with Dr. C's logic that this person shouldn't be representing themselves as autistic while serving on an autism advisory board due to his diagnosis of PPD-NOS having been conducted too late in his life to meet Dr. C's standards, or perhaps too early to have been made in a part of the current DSM-5 autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. But even if that person had been formally diagnosed with DSM-5's autism under those standards, which is exactly what the DSM-5 says shall happen in the first place to people who had a DSM-4 era PPD-NOS or Asperger's diagnosis, I have every reason to believe that you and your friends would be using that updated diagnostic status as proof of how meaningless the diagnosis was and how they shouldn't have been able to be assigned that label in the first place.
How is it that somebody who is extremely capable, extremely competent verbally, competent socially, competent in terms of her functionality, I'm sure she is quirky, but why in the world does that have to be labeled autism? It is so utterly meaningless that, this highly successful, articulate person who's completely functional.
Why autism? Why is this the label? Why can't we come up with something else to apply to people like this? What about another diagnosis for, these people who are so super functional, so super successful? They don't really have, severe social communication problems because here they are. They're able to, to express very complicated thoughts and, converse daily. What about another diagnosis? I mean, is there anything in the DSM? And you guys are members of the APA, right? The American Psychiatric Association. I mean, is there anything in the book that could be applied instead of autism, some kind of personality disorder?
You know what? I'm starting to think the National Council on Severe Autism is really just severely silly in ways that I'll further describe in Part 7, because 6 episodes in, I've only covered 25 minutes of the main NCSA podcast episode that my series is concerned about. And the funny thing is, that episode's only an hour long, so I only have 3 episodes left to cover an entire half hour of NCSA podcast material. So I will see you next time, and thank you very much for watching.